They had been married for 9 years, long enough for love to stop announcing itself and simply become the furniture of daily life. Present, necessary, unnoticed. Daniel was a civil engineer who built things meant to last. Bridges, retention walls, the quiet architecture of patience. Priya worked in marketing, where perception was the product, and the line between performance and truth had grown soft over years of practice. What neither of them understood, not yet, was that a marriage can be structurally sound and emotionally hollow at the same time, holding weight without holding warmth. The tension between them was not violent. It was the kind that collects in silences, in small withdrawals, in the way a person stops turning toward you when they laugh. Thief, you Gala. Daniel ironed his own shirt because Priya had left for the salon earlier than expected. He stood at the ironing board in their bedroom, watching the steam rise, and thought about nothing in particular. That was the thing about their life. It required no thought. It had become efficient. They had routines that worked. Saturday groceries, Sunday calls with their respective families, Wednesday evenings when Priya cooked something elaborate and Daniel washed up afterward without being asked. They didn't fight often. They had, at some point years ago, learned to want less from each other, which they had both quietly mistaken for maturity. When Priya came home to dress, Daniel told her she looked beautiful. She did. The green silk dress, the way she'd had her dark hair pulled up loosely at the back. She looked like the version of herself she became when other people were watching. He kissed her cheek. She smiled without quite looking at him. The gala was held at the Alderton Group's preferred venue, a renovated warehouse on the river's edge that cost more per night than most people earned in a month. Priya's company had been contracted for the event's branding. This was her night professionally, and Daniel understood that. He understood it the way husbands understand things they've learned not to challenge. He found a place at the bar and ordered a scotch, and talked with a structural architect named George Blaine for half an hour about lateral load-bearing and the problems of soil liquefaction in coastal development. It was a good conversation, comfortable, the kind he was built for. He watched Priya from across the room. She was different in rooms like this, looser, brighter, turning her body toward whoever was speaking as if they were the only gravity in the room. He had loved that about her once, the way she could inhabit a space completely. He had believed in the beginning that he was the space she chose. Her boss, Christopher Alderton, mid-40s, silver-templed, the specific kind of handsome that comes packaged with confidence in tailored suits, materialized at her side sometime after 9. Daniel had met him twice before at company functions. He was charming in the studied way of men who have been charming their whole lives and no longer notice the effort. He touched Priya's arm when he spoke. She leaned closer than the music required. Daniel ordered another scotch. He was not the kind of man who made scenes. He was not the kind of man who stormed across ballrooms or gripped his wife's elbow or said loudly, "What exactly is this?" He was the kind of man who watched, who filed things away, who trusted sometimes past the point of reason because mistrust fell too close to smallness. A woman appeared beside him at the bar, late 40s, composed in the way of someone who has been composed through considerable practice. She ordered a glass of sparkling water. "She's very good at this," the woman said. Daniel looked at her. She was watching the same place he was watching. "I'm sorry," he said. "Your wife." She smiled without warmth or malice. Something more neutral, like recognition. "She's very good at making him feel like the most important person in the room. They all are, the ones he chooses." She extended her hand. "Margot Alderton." He shook it. "Daniel Hartwell." She nodded as if she already knew. She took her sparkling water and said nothing more for a long moment. Then, almost as an afterthought, barely loud enough for him to hear over the music, "Just wait." She moved away into the crowd. Daniel stood holding his scotch, watching his wife laugh at something Christopher Alderton said, her hand briefly touching his lapel, and felt something move through him that wasn't quite jealousy. It was quieter than jealousy. It was the feeling of a man who has just noticed a crack in something he built and is trying to calculate, calmly, whether it goes all the way through. He drove them home. Priya talked about the event the whole way, the lighting, the floral arrangements, a client who'd said something wonderful about the campaign. She did not mention Christopher. Daniel did not ask. At home, she was asleep within minutes, still faintly smelling of the perfume she'd worn only for the room full of other people. Daniel lay on his side and stared at the wall. He didn't know yet what he was waiting for, but something in him had already begun. The weeks after the gala rearranged themselves in Daniel's memory, the way significant periods always do, ordinary on the surface, seismic underneath. Priya's phone became a separate presence in their home. It had always been present, of course, but now it faced down on tables. Now she carried it from room to room. Small things. A kind of couple people assume will grow old without much known. She started working late on Tuesdays. Then Thursdays, she'd come home flushed and energized in a way that the completion of marketing campaigns had never produced before, describing long strategy dinners and rebranding sessions with the team. Daniel listened. He asked follow-up questions. He was, by nature, a good listener, thorough, patient, undemanding. He wondered sometimes if she mistook his patience for oblivion. One Thursday evening he stood in the kitchen making pasta when she texted from what she'd said was the office. "Don't wait up, might be another hour." He read the message and looked at the 2 plates he'd already set on the table and stood there for a moment, just breathing. Then he put 1 plate away, served himself, and ate alone in the kitchen with the radio on low. She arrived home at 11:15. He was in bed, reading. She showered before coming to him, which was not unusual. Except the hour, which was. "Good meeting," he said. "Productive," she said. Christopher had a lot of thoughts about the Q2 direction. The first time she had used his name without being asked, as if the name had grown too present to avoid. "He's very involved," Daniel said. "He's the client," she said. "He's supposed to be." She turned off her bedside lamp. He kept reading for another 20 minutes, though he absorbed none of it. The thing Daniel understood about himself, had understood since he was young, growing up with a father who expressed love through provision and silence, was that he had a deep instinct to engineer around problems rather than dismantle them. He could identify a fault, could calculate its trajectory, could determine the load it would eventually fail under. What he could not do easily was approach the fault directly and name it out loud. This had served him professionally. It had, he was beginning to understand, cost him personally. He thought about Margot Alderton saying just wait, and the thing that disturbed him most was not the warning but its composure. The way she had said it without anger, without pity, like someone reading a weather forecast they've seen many times before. At dinner on a Sunday 3 weeks after the gala, Priya said, "I think I'd been growing in ways that are hard to explain to someone who isn't in this industry." It was not said cruelly, that was the thing. It was said thoughtfully, like a conclusion she'd reached after consideration. "I'm listening," Daniel said. "It's just, Christopher pushes me to think bigger, to not settle for the obvious solution." She was looking at her wine glass. "I've never really had that. Someone who believed in my ambition that way." He let a moment pass. "I believe in your ambition." She looked at him then, and something in her expression was almost gentle. "I know you do, Daniel, but it's different when someone is inside the work with you." He nodded. He ate his food. He thought, she is rehearsing something. She is building language for something she has already decided. He did not say that. He said, "Are you happy with where things are headed? At work?" She looked down again. "I think I'm figuring that out." That night he sat on the back step of their house for an hour after she was asleep, in the cold November air, and looked at the garden he had put in 4 years ago, the raised beds he'd built, the stone path he'd laid himself on 2 weekends in September. He thought about what it meant to build something for someone who would not remain to inhabit it. He was not angry yet. Anger was still forming somewhere beneath the surface, patient and geological. What he felt, sitting in the cold, was something more precise, the particular loneliness of a man who has been present and faithful and mistaken that for enough. It was not a text message in the end. It was a photograph. Priya had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered. Not out of carelessness, he thought later, but possibly out of something between guilt and deliberate provocation, some unconscious desire to be caught, so that she didn't have to be the one to say it. The photograph appeared as a notification preview before the screen darkened. A restaurant he didn't recognize. Priya in the same green silk dress. Christopher Alderton's hand at the small of her back. The caption, "Last night." Daniel set his coffee cup down. He stood at the counter. He looked at the notification until the screen went dark. When she came into the kitchen, he was sitting at the table with both hands flat on the surface. She saw his face and stopped. He didn't say anything immediately. He found that there was not, in this moment, anything particularly urgent to say. The truth had arrived. It had its own gravity now. "Daniel," she started. "Sit down," he said, not harshly, quietly. She sat. She had her robe on, her hair still damp. She looked young suddenly, more human than she had in months. "How long?" he said. She looked at the table. 6 weeks. He nodded slowly. He was aware of his own breathing, aware of the coffee maker running, of the ordinary mechanical sounds of the morning continuing as if nothing had been altered. 6 weeks. While he had been setting 2 plates on the table and putting one away, while he had been lying in the dark, calculating the trajectory of something he hadn't had the courage to name. "Do you love him?" he asked. She looked up at him, and her expression was complicated, not with dishonesty, but with the particular confusion of someone who has been treating desire as depth. I think I feel like myself with him. In a way I haven't. In a way you haven't with me," he finished. She didn't contradict it. He stood up. He walked to the window and looked at the garden. "I want you to understand something," he said, still looking outside. "I'm not going to perform outrage for you. I'm not going to say the things people say in these moments, because they feel required to." He turned. "But I also need you to know that I see exactly what this is." She looked at him carefully. "What do you mean? You've spent 6 weeks feeling desired. That's real. I'm not taking that away from you." He paused. "But desire isn't a marriage, Priya, and I think somewhere in the last few years I confused comfort for connection. And maybe you did too. I just didn't go looking for the difference in someone else's hands." She had begun to cry quietly, not dramatically. Soft, private tears. The kind that come from somewhere genuine. "He's not going to leave his wife," Daniel said. "You don't know, I know." He said it without satisfaction. "Margot Alderton told me something at the Gala. I didn't want to hear it then. But she's seen this before. I think you're going to find that out." Priya wiped her eyes. She said nothing. "I think you should stay somewhere else for a while," he said. "I need to think. And I think you need to find out who you actually are in this situation, without me cushioning it." She packed a bag that afternoon. He carried it to the car for her, because it was heavy, and because that was the kind of man he was, even then. They stood at the car door for a moment. "Daniel, go," he said gently. Not cruelly, not coldly. The way you say it when you mean, "I can't do this part with you." He went back inside and sat in the kitchen for a long time. The coffee had gone cold. The garden outside the window looked the way it always did. He was still there. By March, Priya was living in a furnished apartment in the city. A corporate short-term let, the kind of place that has everything and belongs to no one. She had believed through November and most of December that Christopher would leave. He had implied it in the way that certain men imply things, without direct language, with enough suggestion to sustain hope. He talked about the impossibility of his situation. He talked about timing. He mentioned Margot's anxiety, her reliance on him, as if this were a burden he was nobly enduring on his way to something better. By January, he had stopped mentioning leaving. By February, he had taken someone from the Alderton Group's legal team to dinner twice. Priya found this out not through confrontation. Christopher was too careful for confrontation, but through the particular intelligence network of office life, the quiet observational system that women build for survival in certain industries. A colleague mentioned it with studied casualness. Priya had been sitting at her desk. She had looked at her computer screen for several minutes afterward without doing anything. She called her sister, Rena, who lived in Edinburgh and who had, over video call in November, said, "Priya, I want you to be happy, but I'm afraid," and then been carefully managed by Priya into retreat. Rena answered now without an "I told you so," which was somehow more devastating. "What do you need?" Rena asked. "I don't know," Priya said, and meant it, perhaps, for the first time in years. What she had thought she needed was to be seen, not in the domestic steady way that Daniel saw her, but dramatically, urgently, as if her presence in a room was an event. Christopher had provided that. He had the talent of men who move through women like weather, total while present, completely dissipated after. She understood now that she had been a chapter in a longer pattern. That Margot's composure at the Gala bar had been the composure of someone who had made her own accommodations long ago and was no longer surprised. What she found in the furnished apartment with its generic prints and impersonal kitchen was that the freedom she had imagined, the larger life, the woman who thought bigger, did not materialize without an audience. She was excellent at being witnessed. She had never learned to simply be. Daniel, meanwhile, had done what Daniel did. He had worked. He had finished a long commission, a pedestrian footbridge over a flood channel in the west of the county, and he had spent evenings walking. He walked the canal paths, the old rail routes, the parks that closed at dusk and where he sometimes stayed past closing because no one was checking. He thought, during these walks, about what he had failed to do and what he had genuinely given, and the difference between those two categories was not as clear as anger would have made it. He had loved Priya. He was sure of that. He had loved her in the specific way he loved most things, solidly, without display, with the assumption that love demonstrated through reliability was the most honest form. He was beginning to understand that this was true and that it was also incomplete. That some people need love they can feel actively against their skin, not just underneath their feet. He didn't exonerate her, but he was done with the story of her as villain. It was too small. It required too little of him. His friend from university, a man named Patrick, who had been divorced twice and spoke about it with archaeological distance, took him for a pint on a cold Wednesday and said, "Are you going to try to fix it?" Daniel thought about it. "I don't think it's mine to fix anymore," he said. "Are you angry?" "Sometimes. In the morning, mostly. It passes." Patrick nodded. "What do you want?" Daniel looked at his pint. "I want to stop building things for rooms I'm not in." Patrick didn't answer. He just nodded slowly, the way you do when someone has said something true that you can't improve on. Priya texted in late February. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, not in the way that asks for anything." He read it on a Tuesday morning, standing in a site office with rain on the windows. He held the phone for a moment. He typed, "I know." And then he put the phone in his pocket and went back to work. He was not ready. He was not sure he would be. But something had shifted in him over the winter. Something had settled, the way groundwater settles after upheaval, seeking its own level. He was not the same man who had set two plates on the table and quietly put one away. He was not entirely sure yet who he was instead, but he was interested in finding out. They met in April at Priya's suggestion, at a coffee shop near the offices of the solicitor she had engaged for the separation paperwork. She had chosen the location carefully, neutral, public, practical. This was, Daniel recognized, how she managed things now. with logistics, with the distance of arrangement. She was already at a table when he arrived. She looked different, not diminished exactly, but altered in the way of someone who has been through a fever and emerged with a more accurate accounting of their own physical limits. She'd cut her hair shorter. She was wearing less than she used to. Less jewelry, less color. She looked more like herself, he thought, than she had in years. He didn't say this. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course," he said. They ordered coffee. They discussed the paperwork, the house, the joint accounts, the small logistical geography of dismantling 9 years. She had consulted a solicitor. He had consulted one too. They were, as the solicitors had noted with mild surprise, being remarkably reasonable. Daniel found this unsurprising. Being reasonable had always been his particular burden. When the practical things were done, a silence opened between them. Outside, a delivery van was double-parked and a cyclist was threading past it with visible irritation. "Thinking about what I want to say to you," Priya said. "I've been composing it for weeks, and it doesn't hold together as well out loud." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I wanted to explain, not justify. Explain what I thought I was doing. But I think most of the explanation is just that I was afraid of being ordinary, and I made that your problem." He looked at her. "It wasn't only that." She looked up. "I stopped trying to reach you," he said. "Somewhere around year 6, 7, I stopped pushing at the distance. I told myself it was respect for your space. It was easier than being told I wasn't enough." He paused. "I wasn't blameless in the quiet." She looked at him for a long moment. He thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just nodded, precisely, like someone receiving a piece of information they have been waiting for. "Christopher," she started, "you don't have to. I want to." She looked at her coffee. He didn't leave. You knew he wouldn't. She said it without self-pity. "Margot, his wife, she called me. In January. She wasn't cruel. She just said very calmly that she wanted me to know this had happened before, that it would happen again. She said she'd made her choice about her marriage and that I should make mine." She looked up. There was no anger in her voice. That was the worst part. Daniel said nothing. "I think I understand her now," Priya said quietly. "She's made herself unreachable. It's the only way she survives him. I used to think that was weakness." She shook her head slowly. "It's something else. I don't have a word for it." They sat for a while longer. The van outside finally moved. The coffee shop filled and thinned with its ordinary late-morning traffic. At some point Daniel looked at his watch and Priya looked at hers, and they both understood that they had arrived at the end of what this meeting could hold. He helped her into her coat. She did not ask him to. He did it because it was cold and because the gesture was honest, not a signal of possibility, just a remnant of care that hadn't yet found a reason to stop. At the door she turned. "Do you think you could have been happy?" she asked. "If things had been different?" He thought about it seriously, as he thought about most things. "I was happy," he said, "for a long time. Not in a way I understood to name or protect, but it was real." He looked at her. "I think you were looking for a spotlight, Priya. I understand that now. I just couldn't have given you that. It's not a failing of love. It's just a failing of fit." She nodded. Her eyes were bright but steady. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too, Daniel." He walked to his car alone. The April morning was cold and clean, the light thin and particular, the way it is in early spring when the warmth hasn't committed yet. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about the footbridge he had just finished, how he had walked across it on the final inspection day, the give of it underfoot, the way it held weight without rigidity, the slight motion that was not weakness but calibration. He had built it to last. He started the car. He drove toward the rest of his life, which was waiting for him in its unfinished, ordinary, genuinely open form, not a story of what had been taken, but of what a person becomes when they stop building for someone who has already left the room. Some things are only understood in the leaving. Some losses teach you, with a patience that almost resembles kindness, the precise shape of what you were carrying all along.